Welcome everybody, and it's after 1:30, so I'll make a start. And I'll ask Councillor Hill to say an opening karakia, please.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi mahana a kia koutou, kei te miki a koe Chair Graham, karakia tātou. Whakatake te hau ki te uru, whakatake te hau ki te tonga, kia makina kina ki uta, kia mai taratara ki tai, e hi aki ana te atukura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei, mauriora.
Right, do we have any, sorry, any apologies? Oh. Right, Mike, any others?
I need to leave it for, sorry, if they're not completed by then.
That's fine, okay. Can I have a mover and seconder to receive these apologies, please? Councillor Mackenzie and Graham McGlynn. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against, carried. Thank you. Declarations of interest. Are there any additional declarations that members of the committee want to declare to the meeting? Councillor Graham McGlynn.
Promotion, Chair. Just to make sure that there's another entity, I'm now assisting the Victoria Auditor General's office. It's very unlikely to be a conflict with any business that Tasman does, but for completeness that should be added, and I'm happy to update if Secretariat can send me any appropriate forms.
Thank you. Any others? I'll take that as a no. Can we move on to the confirmation of minutes for the meeting that was held on the 17th of March? And does anyone have any corrections or adjustments they wish to be made to those minutes? Can I have a mover and seconder?
I'll move, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Ogilvie, and seconded by Councillor Hill. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, carried. Thank you. So this brings us to presentations. And I understand we have a presentation from Aon.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, Aon have been invited along to give us a market update. So I think I'll pass immediately to Matthew Wilson and Deanna McDonald from Aon for them to talk to a slideshow they have. Thank you.
Welcome.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Is the present, those of you, excellent, here we go. Thank you very much. So we have a short presentation. We were speaking to Matt and he asked us to just give an overview of the current insurance market and a few of the considerations. Now, I do have to declare at the outset that Aon act for you in respect of only the infrastructure insurance that is placed. So that's your reticulation assets and the like. However, the comments we are going to make about the market are largely generic type comments. So they would apply, but as I say, we only act for you for the infrastructure. If we could go to the next slide, please. Just a quick overview of some people involved. Deanna is also on this call. Hopefully you can all see Deanna. Deanna and I work out of the Hamilton office, but we have an involvement with councils on a national basis. We also have a couple of other colleagues who aren't on the call today. Steve Kane, who's the General Manager of our local government risk practice group, and a gentleman called Sam Ketley, who is very pivotal in the infrastructure placements. So that's just a flavour of some of the people that Matt and the others will deal with in the process. Next slide, please. So we will talk about market updates. We will also talk about valuations, and then there's a slide at the end that sort of wraps up a few of these bits and pieces. We act in one way or another for getting on for 69, 70 local authorities. So there are a lot of common issues that we see. So as I say, the comments in this presentation are generic in terms of the insurance market. They are not specific as such to yourselves, but obviously they do impact yourselves. If we could go to the next slide, please. And again, so we'll go to the market update. What you see, oh, thank you. What you've got in front of you there is a graphic which shows where the market has been and where we think the market is going. Specifically, we need to look at the Asia Pacific area, although the infrastructure placement that you have is a global placement. We use offshore markets, London markets, etc. So these comments, as I say, do relate to all classes. Some person, when we did this presentation recently, said, oh, there's a lot of red there. Well, so they actually said there's not a lot of green there. The good news is there is less red. If you look at the global market 2020, there's a lot of red. That's hardening of pricing, that's terms and conditions. We are seeing a stabilization in this space at the moment. We don't think we're at the top of the hill just yet, but we have been in a hard market cycle for most classes of business for about the last 5 years. We are seeing a little bit of an easing in that space. There is a little bit more capacity in the market. We are seeing a slight easing in pricing. So overall, it's a good news story, but as always, I'm afraid there's a couple of caveats to that. If we could have the next slide, please. So the main driver for pricing recently has been natural disaster events, whether they're global natural disaster events. So there's been flooding events in Germany and Belgium. There's been weather events in the US. We've most recently seen the flooding events in Australia, but there have also been events in New Zealand. And this is just a summary table of some of the costs. These are total costs. They're not necessarily just insurance costs, but it gives you an idea that we are seeing an increase in the frequency and severity of these natural disaster type events, largely weather related. So they're largely flooding, etc. So as I say, that's just an overview of some of those things. Next slide, please. So where do we see the market now? We're getting into 2022. As I mentioned, that we've come out, or we have been in a hard market cycle. That means the pricing has been increasing. A lot of insurers are now starting to return some profits. So that is good news, because that hopefully will lead to the easing of pricing and the easing of the increases. We used to refer to underwriting as being sort of 30% science and 70% dark arts. It's now the other way around. There's a lot more data-driven underwriting, technical underwriting taking place. So insurers are looking for more and more detailed asset information, better quality of data, and the better that we can get that, particularly as I'm talking about the infrastructure space, the better we can get that, the better the conversations are we have with insurers. We are seeing the easing in the London markets currently. London markets do historically tend to turn a little faster than the local markets, but we are starting to see those sort of green shoots of changes in the local markets. There are a couple of classes of business which are still very difficult and distressed markets. And as I say, we only act for the infrastructure, so these are generic comments. I can't talk to the other parts of your program. But what we are experiencing is cyber. So your cyber liability type insurance, that's a very tough market at the moment. Insurers are putting up pricing. Insurers are reducing terms and conditions, imposing higher deductibles. So that's a strained market. And also we have a weather eye, if you'll excuse the pun, on the cost of natural disasters, as was alluded to in the previous slide about the increasing frequency. Forestry is also a difficult market currently. And the perennial one with local authorities is the professional indemnity. This is normally around building consenting type issues, your professional indemnity insurance programs. They can be challenging as well. The big focus on with insurers at the moment is valuations. We are living in some quite unique times coming out of the pandemic. there's global supply chain issues, there's people issues. You know, we're seeing a lack of people to be able to do work. And these are all having inflationary impacts on pricing for building materials. I mean, anecdotally, I saw a story in the Herald this morning about the supply of jib board. So these are all things that are having an impact. One of the emerging risks that we are seeing is environmental impairment. And I won't go into that in a huge amount of detail, but under a normal liability policy, and again, I'm couching this as a generic conversation, the policy will exclude pollution and contamination exposures unless they result from a sudden event. If they are gradual, so think landfill sites, methane migration, that sort of issue, then they are normally excluded under a liability program, under a public liability program, whereas an environmental impairment liability policy will consider that type of risk. So that's something we are seeing as a bit of an increase in exposures, and something that needs to be looked at within council from understanding what your exposures are. Next slide, please. So just a bit more flesh on the bones, as it were. As we said, pricing, we're seeing ease. We keep referring to that, but that's actually what we're seeing. Policy limits last year or last 3 years went through a bit of a phase where insurers are being very cautious with their capacity and their capital. Whilst that hasn't changed dramatically, again, we are seeing it easing in terms of having to buy high limits and that sort of issue. So we are seeing market getting more capital into it, which is good news. That then leads on to some more capacity. Underwriters are focusing heavily on retentions, so I think deductibles, especially for frequency type events. And I do have another slide which will briefly cover that off. So we saw earlier that there is an increase in the frequency and severity of those weather events. One of the things we need to be mindful of and keep an eye on is what are insurers going to do about deductible levels for those type of losses? Are they going to look to manage that increased exposure by changing deductible levels or retentions? So that's something we're keeping an eye on for the renewal. And as I say, the underwriting, a lot more rigor is being involved, very data, loss modeling, very focused on technical information, particularly in the infrastructure space, bearing in mind that we are competing, because we use global markets, we are competing with multiple clients to effectively purchase a finite amount of capital within the market. The better quality the data is that we get from you, the more meaningful conversations we can have with the insurers and the ability to differentiate you from lots of other entities who are all chasing that capital. So that's a piece of work that we're working with Matt and his team on in relation to that asset and quality data. Is there any questions so far, or shall I go into the next couple of slides? I am aware we've only got a relatively short time slot for this.
Any questions from the committee? Councillor Mackenzie.
Thank you. I do have a question, and I'm not sure if you can answer it or not, but I chair our enterprise committee, and that committee has in its portfolio our investment in plantation forestry. So, you know, we have about $50 million current valuation of trees, not including the land, and obviously insurance it's a big amount that we pay in our insurance premium. So I guess I've been pondering over the last 12 months really whether it's worth it, and so I'm kind of my question really is there any analysis around maybe a trend towards self-insurance on plantation forests, and what kind of would trigger, when would you get to the point where it just wouldn't make sense to be paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in a premium?
That's actually a very, very good question. It's probably not one that I can answer because we don't act for that class of business, but I can certainly give some general commentary. I would suggest and this may sound self-evident, I'm sorry if it does, it becomes an affordability issue, and then a risk versus exposure issue. Without knowing the background to what you do with these forests, whether they are pure investment or whether and carbon credits is not an area of my expertise. We have a whole separate team of people that deal with this. Whether you are using it for some other reason, it would be affordability. But what I can say is that the forestry market has been a distressed market with a limited number of players for a couple of years, which is probably why you've seen an increase in the pricing. Again, we don't act for you on that, so I can't really go into too much more detail. There's some sort of general comments. There always has to be a cost benefit for this for you. And I guess it would be coming down to doing an assessment on the exposure versus an assessment on premium.
I realised I probably was putting you on the spot, but I guess I'm raising it, and Matt, I'm not asking you to make a comment, but I think that I know when we've discussed it in our enterprise committee, I think what we've been told is that maybe a decision on insurance and how we manage risk would actually be a decision for this committee. So that's why I'm actually just putting it on the table to prompt some thinking.
There is, if I may, a slide at the end which will show you, which might go somewhere towards explaining a process around that whole risk versus exposure type consideration.
Okay, I'll wait for that. And by the way,
Okay.
I just wanted to say, I love that photograph of the lighthouse. It almost makes you feel nature, doesn't it?
It does. Could we go on to the next slide, please? So we'll talk about valuations. Thank you. Why are valuations important? This is a simplistic diagram. As I say, we only deal with the infrastructure, so don't get confused, please. The fact that this is graphically representing above ground assets, this isn't pointed towards that above ground program. This is just a comment about why values are important. There is a curve shown on the graph. That curve is, we refer to it as a number of things. You can call it an underwriting curve, whatever you might want to call it. But if you imagine that's the losses that are suffered. To the left-hand end, you've got high frequency losses, but low value. And to the extreme right, you then have low frequency, but high value. The vertical blue line on the left-hand side is a graphic representation of where your excess or deductible might sit. So you in essence self-insure a component by way of a deductible. And if you think of it from your own private motor insurances, for example, you'll have a $500 excess or $1,000 excess, depending on what it is. One of the ways of treating your expenditure is where do you attach on that curve? What level of deductible are you happy to take? What can you afford by way of an organisation? How healthy is your balance sheet, etc. As we move across to the right, there is a second blue line. That's meant to be a representation of a loss limit. You very rarely buy, when you have a big asset base, you very rarely buy an insurance program for the full, complete replacement cost of every single asset that you own, because you are not going to lose all of them unless it's a very bad day in one go. So therefore, programs are largely designed around what is an expected severity event and what loss limit do we buy, and there's modelling is done to predict some of those numbers. The bit in the middle, the sort of the pinky coloured bit, that's what the insurance program deals with. Why insurance values are why replacement values are important is simplistically, and I'm not doing loss modelers any favours when I say this, but simplistically, if your values are out by 30% going into the loss modelling, then there's a very good chance that the loss modelling might be out by an equivalent amount, because they calculate what the expected losses are based on the values that are provided. And we are in exceptional times at the moment. We are seeing significant inflationary pressures going on for those geopolitical reasons that we've spoken about or sort of mentioned previously, supply chain issues, COVID issues. There is a lot of pressure on pricing. So it's very important that for the certainly the one we deal with, the infrastructure program, when we go through to November, which is the renewal date, that we make sure the values are adequate. Now, I can say that Matt, we've spoken to Matt about this. He's already seen this in another presentation, and work is happening in that space. But that's the main reason why values are driving all of this, and we need to make sure that they are accurate and they represent the replacement cost of your assets. Could we go on to the next slide, please? And again, please. So this is leading back to that previous question about the forestry in a way. Another council that we act for calls this the hexagon of doom, euphemistically. So we have been asked by a lot of councils to provide them with an insurance strategy. So these are the councils who we act for, where we place the entire programme, whether that be liability, material damage, motor, etc., infrastructure. If you are using your insurance premium spend to dictate what your insurance program looks like, in my opinion, that is a little bit tail wagging the dog. Whilst it's very relevant, it's still a little bit tail wagging the dog. And to the comment made about the forestry, if you follow this process around in a sort of, you know, in the clockwise fashion, first thing we need to do is determine what your risks are. What are your exposures? The second thing is your financial ability to deal with those. And then loss volatility estimations on your material damage. You know, are we up or down on the expectation? Could there be a really severe event that causes a problem that's not being factored in? What are you doing to mitigate those things, the control and prevention? What resilience is there in the network, for example? Are you going through a process of replacing old brittle pipes with HDPE pipes that then means they perform better in the event of an earthquake, for example? So you're building in resilience. Once all those factors are understood, then the last thing you can do is go and buy an insurance program that is I won't say fit for purpose, is more aligned with your overall strategic objectives. And you've taken into account what your balance sheet may or may not look like. You've taken into account what level of deductible that you'd be prepared to withstand because the balance sheet might be healthy. Or you don't want to cover certain types of property, those sort of conversations. That sort of links into that forestry example. What's the premium spend versus the exposure? What are the longer term impacts if you were to lose that forest and have a, I don't know, $5 million claim, $10 million claim that you'd have to self-fund because you didn't buy the insurance? It's just starting that conversation. As I say, this is a generic diagram. It's not directed at yourself per se, but it is a process we are trying to take our council clients who we act for everything. We're trying to take them through this process so that there is a more informed way of buying an insurance program, which hopefully will lead to either a reduction in costs or a better understanding of the application of that program. I think that's the last slide, because we are mindful of time. Are there any other questions? I mean, we're happy to field any questions, but I am aware of time.
With the assets that you cover for TDC, has TDC gone through that process that you just outlined?
We are going through that process. It's iterative. We do it every year. We try and have a look at that and have those conversations. We're starting that process now for this year's renewal period. So we are having those conversations, or we'll be having those conversations with Matt and the people that pull those schedules together. Yeah.
I suppose to add to that through you, Mr. Chair, is we haven't though come back to this committee and had those discussions. So that's certainly something that needs to happen. You know, historically, we have done it with Aon, but it's been a decision sort of at the staff level that's got us to what we're insuring at the moment. So certainly the idea is hopefully in 3 months' time, in the next one of these, we can actually have more of a conversation around what we're actually doing and why we're doing it. So forestry is a good example of something that this committee should be considering.
And yeah, I think also loss limits and risk appetites need to be considered as well. Councillor Ogilvie.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your report, Matt. It's been very interesting reading it this morning and listening to you this afternoon. Do I detect from insurance companies a sort of more active involvement in local government affairs? That's from an elected councillor's point of view. Are you getting involved maybe in long-term plans, annual plans and the likes? Given the importance of, say, disaster, even the below ground aspects that you're involved with. So is there a more stronger involvement coming from the insurance industry rather than specifically as from Aon?
I can't speak from the industry as a whole. The most recent piece of work that we've done in this space was there was a national adaptation climate change plan that came out. Deanna's nodding her head because she was involved in this process from MFE. And I think the response date on that was around about the 2nd of June. Aon certainly made a submission to them as to how we see the bigger picture should work. I wasn't privy to the entire response that was done at that strategic level that I mentioned previously, but certainly we were encouraging there to be more joined up, shall we say, thinking that it can't just sit on local government alone to deal with these things. There needs to be involvement from banks, there needs to be involvement from central government, the insurance industry on a wider basis. We're all ratepayers, we're all going to have some impact to where these things go. And we certainly, Aon made a representation or took the opportunity to make a representation in that response document.
The reason I ask, Matt, is because when it comes to a disaster or could be of any description, very often we talk to the residents and they may or may not have insurance. Then it involves local government, very often central government. And now we're finding the insurance people are coming more and more into discussion on how to mitigate or even adapt, is to use your comment, to disasters. That could be particularly with below ground pipes and the likes, whether that be wastewater, stormwater, or even domestic water.
Yeah, I think the possible elephant in the room at the moment on this is where the Three Waters reform is going to go. And again, I do understand your comments, and as I say, we're actively trying to engage with the insurers. This is from Aon's perspective. We're trying to engage with the insurers, whether that be at a household level for people who live in flood-prone areas, or whether that's at the council level or the large corporate level for the bigger asset owners, as to how these changes are managed. As I say, I think there just needs to be a joined-up approach, and that's probably not a question I can answer fully, to be honest with you. I can certainly point you in the direction of somebody else who can, if you wish. But we are trying to coagulate all the different areas to try and move forward in the same direction.
I just don't want that particular person to talk to us, probably Matt or Mike Drummond, or from the council executive team, and just to see what the input from insurance can be in terms of looking at how we look at our debt, how do we look at our infrastructure, and what sort of risks we take in terms of that.
Agreed.
Okay. Graham, through you, Mr. Chair. As we progress around the risk governance methodology and understand our assets better, our perhaps appetite for risk and alternatives, yes, it comes to mind that we've got some strategic decisions to make as to assets we may choose not to insure, levels of excess that we're prepared to happen, and whether there's a level of self-insurance. Have you got any comments or guidance in general terms about if we do decide that we've got a higher attitude to risk and we head down perhaps the self-insurance, whether that's by having a higher deductible, therefore perhaps the first layer of insurance and a layered approach. Any guidance and thoughts in that area?
Yes. I'll give you an example which I know is going to be controversial, and I'm sorry I have to keep saying this. We only act for the infrastructure. The example I'm about to give you is, again, sort of a generic comment around the asset selection piece. As I say, we act for a lot of councils. I'm ignoring any local politics in this when I say this. Community halls, toilet blocks. You may have lots of community halls, or a council will have lots of community halls. The area or the township where they are located was thriving 75 years ago. It may be not so thriving now. The property that is there at the moment is a wonderful old wooden frame building, beautiful piece of architecture, could cost millions of dollars to replace. However, community doesn't need the same asset. Now, is there an alternative that could be built that will serve the same function? And as I say, I am taking out all community politics and local politics about people wanting to have those assets reinstated. That is a very brief example of an asset selection piece. Would you replace the asset if it's on your schedule? Have you gone through a process to say yes or no, or maybe? Deductible levels, there has to be an affordability component to it. If you were to elect to take a huge deductible, but it saved you, let's say, $75,000 in premium, and again, all just examples, no real facts around this. You take a $250,000 deductible, let's say it saves you $50,000 in premium. You have a $249,000 loss that you've got to self-fund. Well, when you look at that in hindsight, without any reference of framework as to how you've got to that decision, that's always going to appear to be a bad decision, because you saved $50,000 in premium, but you've now got to find another 200 and something thousand bucks in asset to replace because it falls below the deductible. So there has to be quite a stringent cost benefit analysis to you as well. And then that ties up with your risk appetite. So those are just two examples of things where, as long as there is a process that's gone through that, as Matt said earlier on, that is reported back to yourselves, and you can see how the decisions were made and the rationale behind those decisions. Those are just a couple of things that you could investigate that potentially could reduce your premium spend and align your insurance program to more in what your strategic risk view is.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Matthew, for your presentation.
Thank you for your time.
No, it was very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye all.
Cheers. We now move to asset criticality and resilience in another presentation. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Wouter Wortman. I am Team Leader Infrastructure Planning, and I'm here to talk to you about the work that the Infrastructure Planning team has done in the past around asset criticality and resilience. So I'll be talking to you about the work that we've done to date, next steps that we have currently programmed, and I'll briefly talk about some of the other work streams that are done by other teams in the organization. So the infrastructure planning team has worked on risk and resilience in accordance with the 10 essentials that were developed by the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, as well as an asset criticality and natural hazard assessment. So first of all, the risk and resilience work that was done, primarily to better understand risk and resilience for the district and agree on priority areas. So we held a one-day resilience workshop. This was in 2018, by the way. We held a one-day resilience workshop with key staff and stakeholders. Quite a long day. It was the entire day. Remember, it was in this room. The room was quite full, so lots of people attended from both council as well as outside council, like fire service, police, district health board, and the likes. So the 10 essentials framework that we used for that is developed by the United Nations, is internationally recognized and as a consistent methodology to evaluate disaster resilience. And it covers 3 aspects feeding into council's disaster risk reduction plans. So governance and financial capacity, integrated planning and preparation, and response and recovery planning. And the outcome of that day was disaster resilience scorecards for each of the 10 essentials. Staff and stakeholders scored on a scale from 0 to 3, where we believe we sit. A detailed response and comments were documented in a report, as well as areas for improvement. So from that work, the areas for improvement, I guess, or prioritization were resilient urban development, increasing our infrastructure resilience, and organizing for disaster resilience as the key focus areas. Then following on from that resilience work program, as per the previous slides, one of the focus areas was asset criticality. So we started a criticality assessment framework for the 3 waters, where each asset received a criticality score from 1 to 5, very low to very high criticality, all based on a set of agreed criteria. And again, that was done in a workshop with primarily the asset engineers and other relevant staff. So we agree on criteria, rules, and measures to assess against for each of the assets. And as an example, some of the common criteria that you can think of for 3 waters are things like the number of people that would be affected if an asset failed, whether an asset failure would prevent the use of a critical facility, like a hospital, for example, ease of access or complexity of repair of an asset, and likelihood of an asset being out for a longer time because we can't get to it, for example. Asset failure, potential for an asset failure on environmental, health, and cultural impacts. And then the last one is asset failure has potential to initiate cascading failures as well, because there's interdependencies between assets. So the key outputs were a framework that we use now, that we can use in the future as well on an ongoing basis. The criticality scores were recorded in our asset management system. So our asset engineers have that information at their fingertips. Every time they look in that system, they can see the criticality of each individual asset. And it's been mapped geospatially in a web viewer as well. And this is an example for our wastewater assets, in this case, Motueka. Different colors for the different scores. You can see some red dots, you can see some black dots for probably pump stations. You can see a couple of red dots there around the treatment plant, obviously as a highest criticality there. And then on top of that, we have the ability to overlay any natural hazards. So, for example, sea level rise predictions. or river and stormwater flooding, but also natural hazards such as tsunami risk and fault lines. So we can overlay all that information over the criticality and sort of get a better picture of what that means. So clearly that's not the end of the work. There's a couple of next steps that we have identified and are in the program for the coming financial year, actually. That is, first of all, to develop and apply a criticality framework for other council assets. And the main one there is our roading network. But there might be other assets as well that could benefit from a similar framework. Then develop a risk assessment framework. So it's that's around the hazard likelihood, asset vulnerability, consequence of failure. Based on that risk framework, we can carry out a risk assessment, identify which infrastructure is at the highest risk from natural hazards. Also consider outages, restoration time estimates, and post-event levels of service. And then finally, that then leads to development of risk mitigation options to improve resilience of council infrastructure based on the risks that we have identified. Some other relevant work streams not done by the infrastructure planning team, but others in the organization. In 2017, there was an earthquake and flood loss estimate done for infrastructure assets. I believe that was Aon as well, together with Tonkin and Taylor. Engineering lifelines by civil defence is an ongoing program of works. Coastal risk assessment by the policy team recently completed. A regional risk assessment, which is being done at the moment by civil defence. And then planned for the coming financial year is a climate change risk assessment by the community policy team. And so then to conclude, so it's significant work done around asset criticality, risk and resilience by multiple teams. There's a couple of next steps identified and programmed. However, I must also say that there doesn't seem to be a coordinated resilience work program where all these different aspects are aligned and coordinated. So I think there's room for improvement there. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Councillor Hu.
That's really Chair. Thank you. What's the impact, or what are some effects of not having a coordinated resilience work program? Do we know that? So we can know. I guess you can imagine, but also you'd know that there'd be benefits. But just interested in what's the consequence of that? Are we aware of them?
I think there's quite a bit of overlap between work done by civil defence, for example, but also by the policy team, that we coordinate that better. We also understand better as an organisation what the next steps should be. So yeah, I think it's a matter of better collaborating and understanding what we collectively miss.
Councillor McKenzie.
Thank you, and thanks, Walter, for your presentation. I guess I'm sitting here trying to sort of understand the context for why we've got this topic. And so I guess I'm left wondering, we did this piece of work in 2018, which was sort of broad. We've narrowed the scope down to 3 waters, and we've got a lot more work done. We've got data, we've got it recorded in our system. So I guess my question would be, how do we ensure, what have we done to ensure that this data is kept up to date? How is it systematized within our other processes? How have we, do we use it? So when we develop our asset management plans? How do we use it? So I'm trying to work out in my mind that we did it at a point in time. How can you assure me that it's up to date, it's useful, it's relevant, we use it, and it's a good thing to build on?
Thank you, through the chair. It's relatively up to date at the moment still, but we need to keep it up to date, obviously. We keep developing new information around hazards such as flood models, but also the hazard scientists create new information around liquefaction, for example, that was recently completed, I believe. So that needs to be added to it. At the same time, to answer your question around how do we use it, I think that's still part of the next step. We have this information available. Things that we need, the way we need to use it is around in our asset planning, for example, around replacement of assets. How do we prioritize replacement of one pipe over another using this criticality assessment? And that's part that needs to be done following that next step where we understand the risk as well, because we haven't mapped the likelihood and the consequence and the vulnerability. So it's still work in progress. It's only a first step, and there's more to be done.
Mr. Chair, just so you know, kind of like a business owner in an organisation is the person who's going to live and die about how important this is for them to undertake their work. And so who is the business owner of this system in TDC, and how do I just get an assurance that that person or that manager or that part of the business is going to follow through and live and breathe the.
Yeah, through the chair, the business owners are the infrastructure planners that develop the asset management plans, but also to a large extent the asset engineers in community infrastructure. Dwayne is here to add to that, I believe.
Yeah, through the chair, I'm Dwayne Fletcher, Strategic Policy Manager. I realise some of you may not have met me before, so just putting myself into context. Walter reports to me. I report to Susan Edwards. Yeah, so in terms, I'll just go back a step to your previous question. So there are other things that have occurred as a consequence of that work. For example, the Land Development Manual was reviewed in 2000 and struck in 2019, which included, things like low pressure sewer systems as a standard part of our development framework. HDPE, which was mentioned in the insurance scheme, now is our favoured approach to pressure mains and things like that. So those are more resilient. If you've ever seen an HDPE pipe squish, they're extraordinarily resilient. You can bang them around a bit, drop 2 tons of concrete on it, and they still stay intact. They're absolutely amazing. In terms of the owner, fundamentally, I guess accountability for management of the network sits with the GM Community Infrastructure, but that's probably the owner's call to talk on. When we support them and we're accountable for making the information that they have as up to date as it can be. As planners, what we do is as Walter said, is we factor this into the long-term plans and the asset management plans that we develop. And so the team have a fairly good handle, for example, on where we know pipes that are of a higher criticality and are older and or in vulnerable situations. And for example, there's a network upgrade program from Mapua, which is cognizant of the fact that we have several old pipes that are under the estuaries and things like that. So that's a practical example of how that information is used in activity planning.
Graham. If I may, through you, Mr. Chair, a number of questions. The disaster resilience scorecard, my understanding from the comments was that came from the meeting itself, and it's essentially a self-assessment of those that were at the workshop. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
My experience with self-assessments is usually they have a very bright pair of rose-tinted glasses on them. And so with that in mind, has this actually been benchmarked objectively by someone outside the organisation with expertise in this particular model to validate or question the self-assessments?
The workshop or the results from the workshop, I believe, haven't been benchmarked, but it was led by Tonkin and Taylor, and specialists from Tonkin and Taylor have led us through that process, and also the write-up, the report was done by external, so that's not an entirely internal affair, so to speak, and as well as external stakeholders as well that participated in the workshop. But yeah, I see your point. It was one workshop, a lot of internal staff there. It's in a way primarily a self-assessment. I agree.
So supplementary question, I've often seen these with another ring that goes around with the target position that the organisation should be in. Has that been considered?
But Chair, I don't know if that has been considered at the time. We haven't set those targets ourselves for each of the 10 essentials. That's what I know.
The next question you've, I guess, partially answered with Councillor Mackenzie's questions, but looking at the interface of all of this goes into our asset management plan. So presumably it's also gone into our LTPs and our annual plans. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. So I guess my final questions around your relevant work streams, and with the earthquake one, a key one there's a lot of work being done on is the AF8 project for the Alpine Fault Mag 8 event, which this location is not terribly far off the line. Is that being factored in as the work that's currently being done in other areas on the AF8 project being factored into this, or is that this will precede that?
I think there's quite a bit of work to be done around AF8 and what that means to asset criticality and vulnerability. So I see that as part of that next step where we look at the risk and the likelihood of events occurring and how that affects the criticality of the asset. So it's part of the next step, I believe.
If through the chair I could be indulged. Sorry. The next question might also yield another response. There is quite a significant lifelines project which is being done across New Zealand. I've been involved in the South Island part of it and had presentations about the interactions between various areas and the ability of redundancy on key facilities. If, say, a port in, take Littleton gets, or Wellington gets hit, what's the ability of the local ports here? So decisions made in one area can have ramifications in a much wider area. And also working out who is responsible and what parts various government departments have. Classic example was in the Canterbury floods last year, where State Highway 1 was taken out, and along with it was taken out internet and various communications all routed over the bridges, which were washed out, and understanding the funding and those sort of areas. Have those discussions been advanced with regard to assets and infrastructure in the Tasman region?
Through the chair, there was a lot of question in there. In regards to specifically the vulnerability of ports and what that might mean for our infrastructure in an AF8, I don't think that we have turned our mind to that at all. Although I'm sure the port probably has, and maybe a conversation is necessary. In terms of what would happen in an AF8 type event, that has been definitely on our minds for a while. There have been we've increased the capacity in the team at the end of last year in this water and wastewater area in particular, which is the area that I concern myself with most when I think about AF8. And it's on our work program basically later in this next financial year, I believe. And we're aware of the kind of work that Wellington and Capacity have done, in terms of, the kind of knock-on effects, the levels of service for service reinstatement and things like that. And we want to go through a similar exercise here. There are some kind of national level questions that we probably can't get adequate answers to. Like if there is an AF8 type event, we might have a plan about how we respond, but getting access to materials, for example, might be a challenge at that time. And I genuinely don't know at this point how we would resolve that.
Given the previous presentation on insurance and approaches that might be taken to placing that cover, is this criticality information used in the placement of the council's insurance policies? Because I would have thought more critical assets, you might look at a better quality of cover, and whereas less important assets, you might be prepared to take a greater risk.
Refer to the finance minister if that's okay.
Yeah, through you, I would say that we are not as mature as we could be. So certainly when we've started looking at insurance in the last year, 2 years, in greater detail than perhaps we have in the past, there's any number of questions that are arising. So I would suggest that that is yet another issue that we should be looking at. Right. Almost like the walls, should we, shouldn't we? So, critical assets, etc. So, yeah, it just needs to go into the mix in terms of what we need to consider.
Yeah, because I would have thought that's very useful information.
Yes.
That we should be taking into account in placing that cover.
Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Ogilvie.
All I want to say is thank you all for your questions, because I think they're very good questions, and particularly the one which relates to, or the two which relate to the plans like at LTP and the likes, and your question about insurance, because these are extreme events which we need to ensure ourselves as a council, not against, but work towards. So thank you for the questions.
Thank you. Councillor Hill.
Thank you, Chair. And just looking at the the overlays that you can put in around stormwater, and what's been our, I might have missed this, but what's been our response to the quite recent report that came out around sea level rise and tectonic plate movement that causes a drop? I think the lead scientists, Levy and Naish. What are we doing? How are we thinking about that? Because that would impact significantly the overlays that you'd be using over long term.
Yeah, look, through the chair, I'm not fully aware how the policy planners have responded to that new information that includes land subsidence. However, my view on sea level rise is that there is a level of uncertainty, and we're planning for a range of different sea level rise scenarios, so to speak. So it's more a question of when does a certain level of when does sea level rise occur, and by how much, and in some of the instances it might occur sooner than we previously expected. So it's more around that adaptability to respond to different scenarios.
Through Chair, I might just supplement that. So Walter and his team, just to give you a solid example of that, already plan at this point for sea level rise in 100 years' time, and when they're looking at things that drain water, a storm in 100 years' time, a 100-year storm in 100 years' time. So when Walter's saying, it's about how soon that occurs, we are definitely thinking long term already when we're making infrastructure planning decisions. What might happen is that might not be an event in 100 years' time, it might be in 80 years' time.
Because this report is talking about significantly different figures, like a metre, 2060, a metre in some places. So, if they're right, if that comes to bear, then it's pretty significant, isn't it, really? Given what you're required to do around planning and in anticipating as much as you're able.
Yeah, correct. The main challenge is there. Like Dwayne was saying, it'll happen sooner than we previously anticipated. Yeah. So we'll have to act quicker.
Yep. At risk of going outside my stated area of expertise, my understanding is the East Coast is going over the West Coast as far as the Alpine Fault, and Kaikoura went up by 1 metre or so. I believe that this side of, we're on the wrong side of the Alpine Fault on this side. So I think that's potentially the point that Councillor Hill was alluding to with the tectonic plate movements, that we might find that this side goes downwards in something like an AF8, which would, of course, bring forward the sea level rise.
Through the chair, my understanding of the report is that it's a constant lowering of the land actually by a couple of millimetres per year, which has been recorded over the last couple of 10 years. And the assumption is that a similar lowering of the land will keep occurring in the future. So taking that assumption, we're not only getting higher sea levels, we're also ourselves, we're going lower. So relatively, sea level rise is going to have a bigger impact.
Could I just add, Chair, that so they're talking about 30 centimetres of sea level rise not being 40 to 50 years away, but in 10 to 20 being possible. So that's pretty alarming. And, in terms of the getting there sooner, it's pretty soon if that was to be the case.
Any further questions from the committee? Thank you very much for your presentation. It's, I think you can see there's a lot of interest, and it's certainly, I think, brought a new dimension to the thinking this committee's got to do. Thank you. We now move to the Chief Operating Officer's report, and is Jenna going to present this, or?
Good afternoon, councillors. It's a fairly straightforward report, and I would like to take it as read, please.
Right.
Happy to take any questions.
Any questions? I think we can assume that's a no, so you can save your voice. Do we need to receive this report? Thank you, Councillor Ogilvie. Can I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Mackenzie. All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. Thank you very much. And try and save that voice and get well soon. The next one is the internal audit update. Charlotte.
Through you, Mr. Chair. We'll just again take this as read and answer any questions.
Right. Committee, any questions? Graham McGlynn.
Thank you for a very good report. It's good to see we've got some internal projects in progress and underway. I see that we've got one provider providing us with 2 or 3 reports, and there's no criticism of that provider. They're very competent. But have we recently gone out and evaluated as a panel all the potential providers and understood their relative strengths and weaknesses so that we can perhaps be sure to be recruiting the best available advice for a particular area?
We haven't done that recently, but it's definitely something that we're aware of. And as soon as our new internal auditor starts next week, it's going to be one of her first priorities.
The lack of progress on the expense claims, what do you attribute that to? Sorry.
Well, when I looked into it, it was mainly just to do with GL coding, and I think we could make the form and raise awareness and educate people on the coding. And I think if it was an electronic form, we wouldn't have the issue in the first place. There's always going to be issues with people not explaining claims properly, and we'll just do ongoing training and probably add a bit more guidance and just try and prompt people and keep educating.
So is there a plan to move to an electronic claiming form?
Well, it's all part of, we're considering it within SharePoint of what we've already got, but there isn't a current plan just to do with the approved. Yeah, there's a few issues. There isn't a current plan, no. I'm going to look at the payroll. So we're getting a new payroll system, and that potentially have a module in there that we could have a look at.
Yep.
We just don't want to have too many systems for staff to end up using, and it's on the radar.
Okay. Councillor McKenzie.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions, if I may. I mean, just to follow on in terms of the expense claims, I was kind of still left wondering when I went through the data. I don't think it was in there. I'm like, well, okay, maybe there's 3 people who are constant repeat offenders, because it didn't actually, the data didn't tell me how many people or whether it was, you know, a lot of people. Anyway, so if it was 3 repeat offenders, then that might be a bit easier to crack down on as opposed to everybody. Anyway, it's just a comment. The procure to pay audit, you know, when I was sort of reading through the scope of it, I mean, I know they've got to do all of those bullet points. They're all important parts of an audit, and I'm not an auditor, so I won't pretend to be, but I was kind of thinking in some respects it was a bit ho-hum, and I was sort of left really kind of wondering, are they going to assess, I mean, do we have a procurement strategy? Do we have a procurement policy? Would they actually be assessing whether that policy is fit for purpose? Because I didn't see those higher level things coming through in the audit. And then when I got to the point where they've actually repeated their bullet point twice, it did make me sort of think it was a bit ho-hum. And then when I read the IQA report, which comes up later on in our agenda, on the digital transformation project, one of the recommendations that came out of that report was actually suggesting that we needed to have a contract management policy and a contract management plan. And so then I'm thinking, well, where is that in the Crow audit of procure to pay? Because actually contract management is a component of procure to pay in my mind. So don't know if you want to comment on any of that, or
I can make a couple of comments. So with Audit New Zealand, and they look at it from a very much of a high level, and we're well, like, as far as I'm aware, we don't have a procurement strategy, and that's one of the kind of the areas. And we had an opening meeting with Crow yesterday, and they're definitely asking about the procurement strategy and the policy, and we should definitely expect that to come out in the report. But yeah, agree that that could have been in the terms of reference more clearly. We are keeping it quite small, and for what we were discussing earlier about that we don't have the internal we want, I don't know if I'm articulating this. Okay, we want to keep it quite small until we've really got a better risk-based internal audit program and approach. So if we're going to look further into procurement, then we will be looking at different providers and making sure that we've got the best. Yeah, Leonie can.
You there?
Yeah.
So one of the things that I was expecting when I came here would have been an audit program around the other aspects of the business. And I know that we do great audits in the finance space, but we didn't really have a program around many of the other areas. And I always feel that procurement is always a level of risk for any organisation. So when we decided to do the procurement one, we wanted to do sort of a lightly over. When I say lightly over, quite focused on the everyday work that we do, because that's where I believe is quite often the risk. It's always in the smaller procurement space. In the contract management space, we have much more rigour. However, that doesn't mean to say that this audit won't pick up some things in that space. And it also doesn't preclude the fact that later we will do a very extensive procurement audit. We at the moment do not have a procurement advisor. They've left the organisation. Out of this, we will imagine that there will be a recommendation that we have a procurement advisor. We do have a procurement policy. We don't have a procurement strategy. So there's a whole lot of things that aren't there, I'm trying to say. So I guess what this will raise is enough for us to be getting on with until we actually get our audit and risk advisor, who's starting, I believe, in the next week or so. And part of her program will be to put together an assurance mapping exercise. Where's our risk? And then develop an audit program. So that's a long answer to probably a short question, sorry, but we're very deliberate in keeping this quite constrained, and also recognising the amount of work the finance area are under at the moment as well. We didn't want to also have auditors in here for a length of time. So I think this will be a good start.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looking at both the credit card and the expenses claims, the information provided to us would suggest that these are perhaps more technical, documentational issues that are arising. So the question is, have there been any evidence of inappropriate expense claims or use of credit cards?
No, and we are very careful in this area, and if there's anything that's outside of policy, so in our sensitive expenditure procedures, we set out quite clearly what can and can't be claimed, and if it's outside of policy and there needs to be a judgment, then Leonie, Chief Executive, is involved for a decision-making process.
Thank you. So in summary, there's no evidence of any breaches of policy, inappropriate expenditure, inappropriate reimbursements, inappropriate use of credit cards.
No.
Thank you.
The conflict of interest review that you did using Infolog was obviously quite effective.
Yes.
How often do you propose to repeat that?
I think it's something that we should be running, ideally, now that we've put all suppliers through it, it should be something that we run when we are setting up suppliers. That would be the ideal goal. But in the interim, I'd be looking to do it on a quarterly basis.
But also, this clearly, you need to get everyone declaring their interests, and people forget. And so you really need to do it regularly enough that it's going to flush those interests out so they don't come back and cause embarrassment to the council.
Yes, well, we didn't, of 350 or however many staff, we didn't actually find any undeclared interests. So that was good. And for councillors, we didn't find any undeclared interests either. It was just the transactions that had been missed for one.
Okay. Thank you. Any more questions? Councillor Hill.
Thank you, Chair. So in terms of credit card transactions, software, about $18,000. Just what's, I don't know. Software is being paid for with a credit card. Is that what it means?
Yes, it's software that's Steve, if Steve's there, might have a comment on it, but it's software that can only be paid for by a credit card. we review everything that comes up on a credit card. We challenge because we like because purchase orders is our number one procurement payment method. So we do discuss with staff anything new coming on credit cards that could have been paid elsewhere. So it would be because that's the only option.
Yeah, happy to add to that, Mr. Chair. It's one of the things that's a little bit concerning because it's increasingly common for software vendors to seek payment through credit card, particularly where you use subscription-based services. So you're in your own domestic environment, you might think about something like buying some antivirus software, for example, which has got a monthly subscription. So we find that in our space, there are a number of different things that we need to purchase that are relatively low level, but cumulatively add up. And credit card is the only means with which those services are offered to the marketplace. An example of that might be around a registration of web domains, for example. And we are seeing an increasing need for that. Most recently, we've purchased Starlink to provide alternative connectivity for the EOC, and that can only be subscribed to via credit card.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Thank you for your report. And you may as well stay there because I think you're speaking to the next one, which is the external audit matters.
Yes, so we'll take this report as read as well and take any questions.
Any questions? Doesn't make particularly good reading on the timeline, does it? Gets worse every year.
Yeah. Yes, it is a concern with the timeline and whether the audit will stick with the new timeline that's been proposed. The first year we haven't had an interim audit as well, and that's going to happen just at the beginning of the final one in October, hopefully.
Not ideal because it gives you no opportunity to address any weaknesses get identified.
No, that's the biggest concern through Mr. Chair, is that the whole relevance of an interim audit is lost when they're doing it with the final audit. I think one silver lining to it all is at least now we know we've got some set dates where we can start working on the annual report. Last year it was a 6-month marathon. This year at least we can be more focused in terms of what we do and when. So that will free up Charlotte's team from just doing an annual report to at least being able to add value in other parts of the business.
Councillor Mackenzie.
Yeah, I did just have one question. And I'm not sure whether I answered it myself when I was reading the papers, but just with the work program for the audit. So given that the council's involved in setting up Infrastructure Holdings Limited as the holding company for the port and the airport, if that was to be implemented on the 1st of July 2022, would we need to be having any discussions with Audit New Zealand about that? And have we included that? Do they know about it? Or, yeah.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would assume we would. We had a meeting that I was actually ill at last week with John. We didn't discuss that with John.
No, but they're aware.
Yeah, I think they are aware of it, but I mean we could certainly have it again to make them very aware. They obviously they audit Nelson, and do they do the ports as well?
The airport.
They do the airport, so I'm sure they're aware of it. But yes, we could make sure that it's not going to trip us over.
Right. With the delays in the audit and the extra 2 months that the government's kindly given entities to get these done, we're going to be faced with the fact of potentially this council has made decisions on all the accounting matters, but it's going to be next council that will end up signing off the accounts. Do we have provision and procedures in place to ensure that that can happen smoothly?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we're certainly aware of that issue. It was raised. The reality is, even without the delays, we would have been struggling to get this to council pre the elections. It has been possible in other councils we've worked at, but this one, last time the new council adopted the annual report, if you like. Certainly the consistency of the members in this committee, the two independent members will help in terms of being able to give the recommendation to a new full council about that adoption. But yes, it's not ideal.
Right. Councillor Hill.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the performances that are not on target relating to levels of service and long-term plan, the wastewater issues are concerning to me. I know this is sort of probably to be addressed somewhere else too, but you know, we're looking for a minute that overflows are minimised, and there's been 16 temporary wastewater overflow signs erected. I just, whenever I read about, I know, and I assume that it relates to just the big storm events we have, and I just hate to think that we just have to go, oh well, you know, wastewater systems get inundated with stormwater, and so this is, to me, it's quite a significant issue. When I look at the where we're not meeting targets, I mean, you know, they're all concerning, of course, and but that's what stands out to me, is actually that we have wastewater overflowing, and from a cultural perspective too, that's a really significant matter.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm looking around. Dwayne, are you going to volunteer? That it is the Alan Bywater in the community policy team. Thanks, Dwayne.
Yeah, through the chair, in regards to that particular matter that you raised around wastewater, you're already aware of the circumstances that can lead to it. Cracked pipes, gully traps that are poorly formed, land that's raised around the gully traps, even in new subdivisions, because you know, floors are now only 150 millimetres above ground level when they're set, and everyone puts their landscape on top. So it is a constant challenge, and the operations team can probably give you the best idea about their program for addressing wastewater inflow and infiltration. In some cases, it's going to be the only way to resolve it is to increase our capacity. So, for example, I got a wastewater overflow notice this morning as a consequence of an issue in Richmond South here, where there are a bunch of pools that are plumbed into the network because their overflows when it rains go there, and so consequently we're getting a lot of overflows there. That's when it comes into my team, because the only real way to resolve that is to plan for additional capacity in the network. And in fact, I was talking to my team this morning about that very bit of infrastructure we're going to have to introduce into the long-term plan. So yeah, I can say that that way information filters its way into my team, and where it's necessary to upgrade infrastructure or make improvements, it's factored into our asset management plans. But there is an ongoing program of inflow and infiltration detection and remedying, and the council has some powers to require people to fill cracked laterals, for example. And we have a bylaw which says, you know, you're supposed to protect your gully traps from inflow, and so the operations team can give you the best update on how they're going about with those tools available to them.
Councillor McKenzie.
Well, thank you, but since Dwayne's here, maybe he could answer my question as well, because it was also on our performance targets, and it's around the volume and percentage of real water loss from the network. So am I interpreting this correctly, that currently 29% of our water, we don't know where it's going? Is that what this is telling me?
Through the chair, I'm not sure it's quite accurate to say we don't know where it's going. We know it's going into the ground. We know it's used for firefighting purposes. We know it's used for flushing. So it's usually called unaccounted for water in some places. And that's because there are sometimes it's just a consequence of your network and the condition it's in. Other times it's a consequence of legitimate use of the water network that's not leakage. Having said that, the bulk of it will be leakage. It's something like 20 to 25% is pretty standard for the industry. So we're fractionally a bit above that, where the team, again, the operations team can give you an idea about their leak detection program because it's ongoing. And one leak can make a massive difference. I recall an example of just 2 years ago where one leak caused 200 cubic meters of water loss per day. In a network like Murchison, that accounted for something like 40% of the water use. So detecting that one leak and fixing it drove that right down to below 20% figures. The team have an ongoing program. They get specialists in to detect it and they remedy it through either fixing the repairs or replacing short sections of pipe. Also, a renewals program is pretty important because older pipes tend to be more leaky, and that's based primarily on criticality and age, more age than criticality at this point because we don't have that many critical pipes that are old, although they are coming into the next 10 years. So that will also reduce leakage. However, I do want to say that there is a point of economic disreturn on leakage where you simply, and that is accepted to be around the 20% mark, where if you can get your leakage down to around 20%, the costs of pursuing further leakage reduction simply aren't worth the costs.
Quite good to know that kind of 20% benchmark figure. So useful. Thank you.
Councillor Hill.
Thank you, Chair. So I was sort of alert to that figure too, that target. Where would that 29% sit, do you know, in a over a 5 or 10 year period? Like, are we trending somewhere? And I take the point about the economic recovery, at 20%, it's just, there's not economic value, but there'd be value in terms of water. Depending on what your supply is, we're going to have a big old fat dam up there that's going to be supplying water, which is, certainly be helpful. But, in some systems, I get it, but I'd say that, some systems, 20% of loss in terms of it being a resource, that's a different measure, isn't it, than an economic one.
In terms of your first question through the chair, look, probably something to report back to you on. I can't recall the statistics. I seem to recall it being a long-term trend, but it's a very volatile trend because, as I mentioned before, individual leaks can have a disproportionate effect on a year's results. I know that, for example, we have made significant investments in Mapua. For example, that loss went down considerably. It was very high there in Mapua until we upgraded the trunk main. But that's, even though the trunk main's fairly good, it ends up feeding into a network, some of which is 40, 50 years old. And, there are little leaks in the joins and stuff all the way along there. So the only way to really truly deal with that is to replace it, or even a brand new network leaks. And that's something to probably bear in mind. The pressures are quite high. We operate between 30 metres and 90 metres pressure typically. So, that's pretty high pressure for a pipe, and it's pretty hard to maintain a network over hundreds and hundreds of pipes where you don't end up with some leaks somewhere at some point in time. So I'd probably suggest an action is to report back to you on that kind of long-term leakage trend. That would be, rather than trying to throw it off the cuff. So the second aspect of your question was economic return. It is a challenge to get networks that have water loss below 20%. There are countries in the world where they do so, but they have an extraordinarily high cost of water. Through the dam conversation, this point came up a lot in discussion and information, and I can't recall all the information that's provided to council at the time. But from recollection, that one of the key points we made was that the cost of replacing the network was hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, and that might get you a 20% gain for a little while until it starts creeping back up again. And that is nothing compared to the cost of providing for growth. 20% would be less than 15 years growth worth in the Waimea catchment, and then you still have to provide capacity. So it's kind of one of those trade-off things.
Thank you.
Graham. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've moved through into the levels of service and we've had financial results, but they may be looking good because we haven't spent the money that this year's rates were aimed to do, and that's reflecting the fact we're not getting to levels of service. So just to highlight that there's a critical factor that needs to be thought about in the financial statements, which is our reserves and looking forward about money that we've taken in this financial year to do tasks that will actually end up being executed in next financial year. And consequently, there's a year ago, there would have been the same question. So it's a matter of getting the allocations right to get a reliable financial result, and it needs to be perhaps thought about. So that was more just a comment rather than, I know the accounting team will be on to that. But the other question there, we had several that the drinking water assessors are no longer exist as the Water Services Act has changed and there's not been testing done since July 2021. Can TDC actually do the tests, and are they happening to give us some proxy data to tell us whether in fact we've got an issue or not?
Through the chair, look, TDC already organises the testing and sends it off to the labs for surveying and things like that. What I think the issue is, and I probably bit off the cuff, so I'm a bit wary of it, but there is the auditor, the drinking water assessors usually kind of verify or ratify the extent to which our plans are in progress, and I think that is the issue. That I'm pretty sure the sampling of water and the testing of it is ongoing. I think one of the issues also is that the software that this used to be entered into is, I believe Matt maybe knows more about it than me, is now not offered by the DHBs or whatever. So again, probably an issue for the operations team to come back report back to, but it's not as if there aren't samplings. One thing I probably do want to come away from is any misconception that sampling isn't occurring and testing isn't occurring, because it is. How it's verified and ratified is probably more the issue.
Okay. If there are no further questions, can I have a mover and seconder that we receive this report? Councillor Hill, Councillor Mackenzie, all those in favour say aye. Aye. Against, carried. And I overlooked to receive, pass the resolution on the internal audit update. So can I have a mover and seconder for that one too?
Help you.
Graham McGill, McGlynn, sorry, and Councillor Ogilvie. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against, carried. Thank you. We now move on to the Information Services update.
Through you, Mr. Chair, this is an information update on the activities of the Information Services team. I'm happy to take the report as read and receive any questions.
Okay. Do we have any questions from the committee on the Information Services update report? Graham.
Just a question at 4.2. Do you have an indication when you will receive the report from Audit New Zealand on their review of cybersecurity policy? And can this committee expect to be seeing that report?
Yes, the audit review that happens to Information Services happens in April each year, and then the findings from that report feed into the main audit report for council. So that's the one coming out later this year. So there's not a separate Information Services report, but any action items found during the Information Services audit will be included in that.
Councillor Mackenzie.
Thank you. I just want to come to the IQA report, if I may, by McHale Group. So, I mean, generally, you know, it's great to see such a good review report undertaken. But I have got a question, and it's, I'm just going to find the page number here. It's actually, oh, sorry. It's actually page 103 of their report under key findings on program management. So a key finding, it states that TDC does not have a fully functioning and broad-based PMO function. And then it carries on the rest of the statement. So I guess my question is that we do have a PMO function, as I understand it, that we set one up. I completely agree that it's probably not broad-based because it doesn't cover the whole of the operations of TDC. But so my question is, does the sentence, does fully functioning relate to broad-based? Because it's fully functioning, but only for a segment of the operation. So it took me a bit by surprise, that comment. So I'd just be interested in your comment on it.
I think it's referring to the PMO is focused on a particular project and program area for council and the Jobs for Nature project. So it's not acting as a unified single PMO for the organisation. The IQA report also talks about the PMO for the digital program could be more integrated into the wider council PMO function, and that's certainly something that we're working on.
Okay, because yeah, I did have that thought as well. I mean, you know, I've been in an organisation where, you know, your ICT function has its own embedded PMO, and then you have a PMO in your wider organisation, and sometimes they can get a bit competitive against each other, and sometimes they can, you know, develop a life of their own. So, you know, at the end of the day, TDC is not that big. And so do we want to have a duplicate PMO function embedded in ICT as opposed to organisation wide?
Well, we're definitely looking for them to be an integrated process, and we're also, it's early days for our PMO operating within our digital program. So one of the tweaks that we've done over the last 4 months or so been just tweaked the terms of reference for our portfolio review board, which is managing the portfolio of business IT and digital projects. And the head of the PMO now chairs our portfolio review board. So it's starting to kind of funnel in a single direction and work together.
Yoni.
Just to add to that, the PMO, it's only been recently identified as a role. They've been running PMO functions for a very long time. It's only been since the restructure last year they've actually had a dedicated team, and it's slowly bringing everything into that under one roof. So this is just a reflection of the fact that the ICT program hasn't moved across, and it's always been a full intention that, and I know Steve supports us, that we will have a one PMO and a Prince 2 methodology embedded.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, do I have a mover and seconder that we receive the Information Services report? Councillor McKenzie, Graham McGlynn. All those in favour say aye. Against? Carried. Which brings us to the end of the open section of the meeting. Do I have a mover and seconder for going into public excluded? Thank you, Councillor Ogilvie. Thank you, Councillor Hill. All those in favour say aye. Contrary? Carried. Thank you. Sorry. Certainly. Can we just absolutely. Well, just take a 5-minute break while we convert to public excluded. No, not at all. Right. So we're back in the PX segment of the meeting, and the first matter of business is to approve the minutes of the meeting on the 17th of March this year. Do I have a mover and seconder, or are there any modifications